So my first take is that the results are favorable as we anticipated, to the extent that the reopening in China had Apple well positioned from a supply chain standpoint and a demand standpoint when you think about it, 10% of revenues are to Chinese consumers. I also think they got an added boost from foreign exchange rates when you think about how, when compared to the December quarter, the US dollar weakened against the pound, the euro, and the yen. So good results from Apple, which is very encouraging.
On that international picture there, Tom, when you talk about the Chinese market, I mean, how much of this is kind of the tip of the iceberg? How do you see this momentum carrying into the current quarter, just given that how much time has passed since China has essentially switched or shifted their COVID policy?
I think the good news is that the March quarter results suggest that the challenges they had from a supply chain standpoint and from a demand standpoint, that those sales shifted into the March quarter instead of being lost entirely. So I do think that there's another opportunity for more of those sales to be shifted into the June quarter, the next fiscal quarter for Apple. So I think there could be additional momentum on the Chinese reopening trade for Apple.
Tom, when it comes to some of the moves that Apple has made over the last several weeks and really months, diversifying its manufacturing footprint, really trying to move some of its production, more of its production out of China. What do you make of that move there? And we talk about a potential catalyst here for Apple going forward, or what could really maintain the momentum that we've seen since the start of the year. How big of a boost do you think could potentially be provided by India?
Yeah, so the good news for Apple is that they have the playbook for India to some large degree, which is China. So long term, we're the company to be able to rely on India significantly for its supply chain to a much greater extent than it does today, and generate 5 to 10% of sales to consumers in India. That would be a tremendous success. I do think, though, that's going to take a very long time. One, to switch their supply chain to be less dependent on China, and two, on a relative basis, there's more consumers in China with higher discretionary income today than India. So basically, they need the emerging market of India to grow so more consumers there can afford Apple's products.
Tom, let me push back on that a bit, because we have heard that argument before about the playbook from China translating to the playbook in India. The reality is, over the years, that just hasn't necessarily materialized. What has changed this time around that gives you more optimism in the Indian market? Because Apple's been trying for years to compete in a big way.
So I would agree to the extent that Apple is yet to come up with an inexpensive iPhone to penetrate the market in India, which is very dominated by Android devices. What has changed, I think, is that Apple realizes that it has to diversify its supply chain so it's less dependent on China. I think that's what's changed. So I'd argue that maybe there's a greater necessity here. And because of the greater necessity, Apple will place more of an emphasis on it. And then over time, that will lead to ultimate success.
Tom, why don't you think we're seeing more of a reaction in shares after hours? Because when you take a look at the stock right now, it's pretty muted, given the fact that it beat on almost, not all, but almost all categories here.
So an argument can be made that the good news was already in the shares, to the extent that if you look at the performance of Apple stock in the calendar first quarter, it had one of its best quarters in many years. Now, I think that was a combination of the reopening trade in China and also expectations that the Federal Reserve is at or near an end in raising interest rates. So I think you could argue that the muted reaction after hours is a reflection of the strong performance year to date in shares of Apple.
Tom, I'm curious to get your take on Apple and this high savings yield account. I mean, we have heard that initial push here reportedly attracted $1 billion in deposits. I mean, I realize this is a long-term play, but really, what is the play for Apple, and how significant is this banking business going to be?
So it's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I will admit that I was initially too pessimistic on Apple Pay. I didn't think that Apple Pay would become so prevalent as it is today. So I think I had the same initial reaction to this very high savings rate account that Apple's offering. The suggestion that there's $1 billion already in those accounts is very encouraging. But I do look in that case for more information on the earnings call to find out what is the strategy and why is it so important to offer such a high rate on these savings accounts, and what will that, how will that help Apple? I know they want to become the digital wallet, but is it really necessary to have such a high interest rate to advance that effort? And that's unclear to me right now.
Tom, what do you think about the fact that Apple just has been pretty light on the product side as of late? That has been the criticism that people that have been neutral on the stock, bearish on the stock, have been pointing to. How critical is it, do you think, that Apple really ramps up that side of the business, the product side, with new innovation and quickly?
I do think it's important from a long-term standpoint. They've benefited tremendously from the 5G network upgrade. And an argument could be made they've only had marginal improvements for the last couple generations of iPhones. I am of the belief that at some point in time, they will expand their product lineup to include an augmented reality, virtual reality product, and then further down the road, automobile, a self-driving automobile. And I think at some point in time, the stock's going to need incremental new products to sustain revenue growth, to sustain the stock's performance. So I do think that's important over the long term.
Tom, always good to talk to you and get your take. Tom Forte with D.A. Davidson joining us there on Apple. And be sure to tune in later as our very own Brad Smith and Diane King Hall dive into the numbers after the call. That is around 6 p.m. Eastern tonight.